Good morning. I just dropped my kids off. I don't know how you guys feel about getting out the door in the mornings, but imagine adding 2 other human beings to that. So it always feels like a victory when I get to this point in the day. But I decided to just pull over and do this open mic prompt so that I did not let the day get away from me like I did yesterday and not get it posted. So I want to actually think about the form of the novel a little bit and sort of as it's connected to social critique. So I'm not bringing space in overtly this time, although we can sort of think about that. I think kind of like Vanity Fair, this novel seems a little bit harder to think about space, so I'm curious how people might find ways to do that. But I do want to think about form, and I want to think about the Tenant. You know, we've read several novels now, and kind of where is the Tenant in that sort of line of novels. So we've done a straight autobiography, pieces of it from Martineau. We've done sort of a life writing type memoir from Seacole. We've done sort of a more satirical realist novel. And then we just recently finished Jane Eyre. So also realist, but mixed with some gothic. And I was looking at some of the reviews in the back, and they brought up some interesting questions about satire. So part of what I'm interested in thinking about in Tenant is what surprises us, because our expectations, I think, are so structured around Charlotte Bronte and her novels and what she says about her sisters. And so sometimes when you come to read Tenant of Wildfeld Hall for the first time, I think there are lots of surprises that happen. So I'm sort of interested to know, like, what surprised you about this novel? And connected to that is kind of what do we think Anne is doing to sort of take author intent out of it. You could also just ask, what is the narrative doing in performing these sort of social critiques? So let me locate this a little bit and remind you what Charlotte said about her sister. So in my broad view, these are several appendices in the back, but this piece I'm about to read to you actually comes from that biographical notice that I have posted online on Canvas in the Jane Eyre material. But Charlotte says, "The Tenant of Wildfeld Hall by Acton Bell had likewise an unfavorable reception. At this I cannot wonder. The choice of subject was an entire mistake. Nothing less congruous with the writer's nature could be conceived. The motives which dictated this choice were pure, but, I think, slightly morbid. She had, in the course of her life, been called on to contemplate, near at hand and for a long time, the terrible effects of talents misused and faculties abused. Hers was naturally a sensitive, reserved, and dejected nature. What she saw sank very deeply into her mind. It did her harm. She brooded over it till she believed it to be a duty to reproduce every detail, of course with fictitious characters, incidents, and situations, as a warning to others. She hated her work, but would pursue it. When reasoned with on the subject, she regarded such reasonings as a temptation to self-indulgence. She must be honest. She must not varnish, soften, or conceal. This well-meant resolution brought on her misconstruction and some abuse, which she bore, as it was her custom to bear whatever was unpleasant, with mild, steady patience. She was a very sincere and practical Christian, but the tinge of religious melancholy communicated a sad shade to her brief, blameless life." So this is sort of Charlotte's assessment. And then I want to read 2 paragraphs from 2 different reviews. One is from Charles Kingsley. Some of you may have heard. He was also an author, but a little bit later in the century. And he begins his review by saying, "A people's novel of a very different school is The Tenant of Wildfeld Hall. It is, taken altogether, a powerful and interesting book. Not that it is a pleasant book to read, nor, as we fancy, has it been a pleasant book to write. Still less has it been a pleasant training which could teach an author such awful facts, or give courage to write them. The fault of the book is coarseness, not merely that coarseness of subject which will be the stumbling block of most readers, and which makes it utterly unfit to put into the hands of girls." Sorry for assigning this. Of that we do not complain. There are foul and accursed undercurrents in plenty in this same smug, respectable, whitewashed English society, which must be exposed now and then. And society owes thanks, not sneers, to those who dare to show her the image of her own ugly, hypocritical visage. So he's not necessarily faulting Anne for talking about these tough topics, but sort of how she does it. And then he makes this comparison of her novel to satire. But taking this book as a satire and an exposure of evils, still all unnecessary coarseness is a defect which injures the real usefulness and real worth of the book. So here he's going to give an example of what he means by the defect. A defect which injures the, here we go. The author introduces, for instance, a long diary kept by the noble and unhappy wife of a profligate squire, and would that every man in England might read and lay to heart that horrible record. But what greater mistake, to use the mildest terms, can there be than to fill such a diary with written oaths and curses, with details of drunken scenes which no wife, such as poor Helena's represented, would have the heart, not to say the common decency, to write down as they occurred? Dramatic probability and good feeling are equally outraged by such a method. The author, tempted naturally to indulge her full powers of artistic detail, seems to have forgotten that there are silences more pathetic than all words. So he's bothered by the details of the sort of brutality and coarse language that's used. And notice particularly he referenced the fact that this narrative technique of using the diary, that it seems particularly unrealistic that a woman would have written that down in her diary. Okay, one last paragraph, or not even whole paragraph, a few words, where he compares this to Vanity Fair. This is still Kingsley. He says, the author has not had the tact which enabled Mr. Thackeray in Vanity Fair to construct a pleasing whole out of most unpleasing materials, by a harmonious unity of parts, and, above all, by a tone of tender grace and solemn ironic indignation, in the midst of all his humor spreading over and softening down the whole, that true poetic instinct which gives to even the coarsest of Fielding's novels, that's an 18th century satirist, and Shakespeare's comedies, considered as wholes, a really pure and lofty beauty. So I want us to think for a minute why, if Kingsley is taking this novel as a form of satire, he thinks that Thackeray, Henry Fielding, and Shakespeare are doing the satire correctly, and that Anne Bronte is not doing the satire correctly. And then one last little paragraph. I know this is getting long, but I was having fun reading all the different reviews, and I don't know how many of you in your novels have these reviews, but one last paragraph from another review which compares this novel to Jane Eyre. In all this, the reader will discover a strong family likeness to the plot of Jane Eyre, which purports to be written by a brother of the author. It may be curious to point out some additional proofs of this resemblance. In both, the heroines, so soon as troubles thicken around them, take to the open country under an assumed name, where they keep themselves concealed and suffer hardships. Certainly they ought to have had a legal adviser to show them the use of their country's laws. And so in style does this likeness exist. Everyone remembers in Jane Eyre how beautifully, in a few words, a whole landscape is presented to the reader. Aye, and more than that, how cunningly or how magically the author conveys the scene he or she describes to the mind's eyes, so as not only to impress it with the mere view, but to speak, as it were, to the imagination, to the inner sense, as is ever the case with the poetry as is the painting of real genius. This same mysterious word painting is one of the features of the present tale. How plainly, how distinctly do the following pictures present themselves to us, and with what a mystic language do they appeal to our hearts. So whereas Kingsley was thinking about this as satire, this reviewer seems to be thinking about it as very realist, like real in its depiction of landscape and the different spaces, if you will, of the novel, but that in that realistic depiction is appealing to almost sort of a mystical level of our imagination. So Jane Eyre does that, and then this reviewer thinks Tenant does that too. So I'm just giving you a couple options here of thinking about sort of the satire possibly as a form of the novel, realism as a form of the novel, how the structure is set up where we hear first from Gilbert and then shift to Helen's diary, and what that is doing, and then tying that conform to sort of the effectiveness or effect or purpose of this sort of coarseness, right, that bothered Charlotte and bothered some reviewers. What is the role of these sort of gruesome scenes? My favorite, one of my favorite things about this book is that the titles of the chapters are very ironic. So the last chapter that you'll have read for today is titled Social Virtues. And then just think about what is displayed in that chapter. It's one of the most horrifying scenes in my mind of the whole book. And that Anne would call it social virtues, right? So what is she doing there by giving these ironic titles and then kind of jerking us the other direction, actually, in what is depicted? So there are some things for you to think about, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.